Welcome to the Periphery from the Pulaski Institution. I'm your host, Alan Elrod, and our guest today, all the way in Australia, is Dr. Justin Ellis. Dr. Justin Ellis is a senior lecturer in criminology at the Newcastle School of Law and Justice. His research into Digiqueer criminology critically analyzes the relationship between digital media, technology, criminal justice, and queer representation and resistance. And his broader research focuses on the relationship between digital technologies, on institutional accountability, and responsible government. And in addition to that, he's done some very interesting research that is very relevant to some of the conversations happening right now in the US and elsewhere on drag queen story hour and public responses to that. So, Justin, I'm really excited to have you on.
Thanks, Alan, and it's great to be talking with you about these important issues.
So I think one of the first things that might stand out to a listener here in the US is just, I think, the bare fact that this is a driving research question for people outside the US. I think a lot of Americans probably think of the current moment we're having around drag and trans issues maybe as an acutely American issue. So I think one thing that might be helpful is just placing it into the context that some of your research does in terms of how some of this is unfolding in Australia and in the UK, and how that looks like and doesn't look like what's happening here in the US in terms of our new debate that's happening right now about these issues.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Alan. And I think I'd just start by saying that clearly much of this is coming out of the United States, as you and your audiences will know. But what we're seeing, this combination of networked hate, political opportunism, and the co-option of trans rights and drag performance by malign forces such as right-wing extremists, it has broader reach because of the network capacity of digital platforms, for example. And so within that broader context, we've got misinformation and disinformation. And this is, crucial in the sense that a lot of these platforms are operating under US freedom of speech protections that are not often very well qualified and balanced in proportion with other rights. So I think that's definitely impacting us here, for example, in Melbourne, where we've seen drag performances cancelled or postponed, and we've seen Proud Boys and alleged neo-Nazis turning up at events and harassing people. So it's definitely having an impact here, but I think it's nowhere near to the extent that it's playing out in the US.
Yeah, this is actually, I mean, just to be topical, I try to keep up, believe it or not, with what happens in Australia. So I'd seen that there had been a kind of recent issue, right, with a legislator, not in the Australian Parliament, but in the Victorian Assembly, right, going to this event in Melbourne, this essentially an anti-trans event, and then having to at least disavow the fact that neo-Nazi protesters also sort of showed up. And it's always a little, I think in general, it's never probably a good sign if the neo-Nazis show up and say, yes, we're on your side. But I also know this has caused quite a bit. What really struck me as interesting about that I think is it's something I wanted to pursue, and I'll just go ahead and do it now, which is she's from a district in Melbourne, right? And I think that already reveals a little bit of an interesting wrinkle, whereas Melbourne being such a big city, I think in American politics, it would be very hard to imagine someone in, say, the actual sort of districts around New York or Chicago or San Francisco successfully winning on that level of kind of conservative platform. And I'm curious, is this because there's a more openness to certain cultural conservative positions in some of these places, or is it because this doesn't actually read in the same way in the politics in Australia in some of the same ways that it does here? Because here it's very much, if you are opposing drag shows or trans people, you're sort of very firmly on the, if not the right, really kind of the hard right.
Yes, and I would agree. It's a similar case here, and that particular Victorian politician, I think that, and I'm not sure what her status is at this point, but the New South, or the federal equivalent was a woman, Catherine Deves, that was running in the last federal election. And just to clarify, in terms of the comparison with the United States and maybe major cities and people with that hard right perspective running, they can definitely run, but they often are not going to win, definitely not in the lower house. They might get an upper house seat because it's not as competitive, but we're certainly, in our political context, those people are certainly on the fringes. And I think this speaks to another dimension that differs from aspects of the United States that we'll get into in more detail shortly. But the the number of Australians that don't have a religious affiliation, for example, and therefore political parties are not necessarily going to be able to generate the funds for fringe far right views, means that as much as those views get a lot of media amplification, and they definitely do through Murdoch outlets like Sky News in Australia, the likelihood of those people winning over a long time and consistently is pretty low, because most Australians, I think, or at least 2/3 of Australians are pretty libertarian in their perspectives.
That's one of the things that I was excited to talk to you about, especially because your research looks at the US and Australia and the UK. Is the US in that sense is the outlier in terms of our religiosity. I know that Australia and the UK are both pretty secular, if in fact very secular relative to a lot of other countries. And so, when you're looking at, you mentioned at the very top the fact that a lot of these ideas are able to move now along digital networks. So when Australians are interacting with these ideas as they come from the US, anti-trans thinking and some of the new fear-mongering around drag shows, a lot of which do have a conservative bent. Some of our most kind of prominent sort of anti-trans and anti-drag show people here, pundits, are people like, Matt Walsh, who was sort of very vociferously identifies as a hardline Christian conservative. Obviously, politicians across different states who also tend to evoke Christianity. So I'm really interested how, even if these ideas are able to move along these digital pathways across the world and become globalized in a sense, how they are actually imported and then received or tweaked when they come into an Australian context. Because I assume that the religious angle doesn't appeal as much, even to generally right-wing Australian activists.
Agreed, definitely. And I think the distinction between here and many, but also I'd like to clarify, I guess, in the sense that, there are many perspectives on Christianity, and I was looking up some statistics on same-sex marriage. You've got, by some measures, 71% of Americans supporting same-sex marriage. So one of the dimensions that I see here is that you've got this minority, this extreme minority that has disproportionate access to parliamentarians, to legislators, to media, and then it can be amplified through those networks. And I see that as a distinction, particularly in terms of networked and also civil litigation by organisations like Mass Resistance and Warriors for Christ. We just do not have that level of organisation. So I see 3 points here. I see religion as maybe a springboard in the US context that's not going to cut it in Australia. Then you've got they're highly organised and seemingly well-funded, and they've got access to media. But in Australia, to be able to, justify any of these arguments on religious grounds, I mean, we're seeing a resurgence of that in protests in Sydney as well at the moment, with the vandalism of some LGBTQ flags and paraphernalia and what have you. But the broader debate is not going to be won on the grounds of religiosity here. I cannot see that happening. And that's because, and I picked out the data here in terms of Australia, UK, England and Wales, and then the US. So just a quick snapshot. In the 2021 Australian census, almost 10 million Australians reported having no religion. We only have 25 million people. So that is a huge distinction between us and you. And so that's about 40% of Australians who identify as having no religion.
Right.
In 2021 in England and Wales, no religion was the second most common response, encompassing 37% of that jurisdiction. So that's about 22 million people. And that's up from 14 million 10 years ago. But then in the States, so we've got 40% of Australia, no religion, about 40% in England and Wales, no religion, but we've got 3 in 10 US adults are now religiously unaffiliated. So it's lower in the States. But as I said, and self-identified Christians make up 63% of the US population in 2021, and that's down from 75% a decade ago. But that's not the only story, as I've said, because I think US Christians and religious organisations are very well organised and well funded in a way that Australians aren't. So I think that's a really essential aspect of the debate.
That to me, that makes me want to probe a little further with you about sort of how, right? Because in the United States, because there is that religious angle, oftentimes there's this sense of morality that's really brought in. At the top, right? It's not just sort of child welfare is sort of there, and there's some people want to make this if it's with trans issues or things like that, it's with they'll kind of try to make a sort of more sanitized kind of medical argument, but really the moral stuff is there kind of most of the time. And so that makes me curious about the kind of rhetorical strategies that get deployed in the Australian context or in the context of England and Wales. And of course, I'm definitely angling us a little bit towards the issue of TERFs, which is not a strong phenomenon in the United States, but is obviously in England and Wales. And I'd be curious to know if it's getting traction in Australia. Because to my mind, and for listeners who may not be familiar with the term, it stands for trans exclusionary radical feminists. It's the idea that it is a feminist issue to not recognize trans individuals as women, that is a feminist issue to sort of protect women's spaces from trans individuals. And that can even kind of fall down the hill to issues like drag performances being seen as sort of a mockery of feminine traits, et cetera. And it's one of those kind of things that tends to dodge at least the traditional right-left spectrum a little at times. There are people who fashion themselves quite maybe centrist or even progressive who have adopted, probably most famously from the American audience, being J.K. Rowling. And I think a lot of Americans also are probably baffled by that because of the lack of knowledge about the British political context of this movement. All that to say, I'm curious about the rhetorical strategies and how much they do emerge from other moral grounds that are not rooted in religious claims about sort of what's good and right and pure.
Yeah, I think firstly what I would say, and this is borne out in research on Dugin's homonormativity, and what I've seen with my analysis of a lot of media of responses to drag queen story time, is that we've got, it's okay to be gay. From some of those commentators, it's okay to be gay, but drag queens dressing up as women with fake breasts and whatever. Why is that necessary? It's a gaudy costume. It minimises female identity and what have you. That's one element of the debate that was playing out, say, pre-COVID in the United States and in the UK, definitely, and I think to a lesser extent in Australia. But then what we've seen, and I make the distinction here because COVID was a blessing in some ways because it basically shut down protests against Drag Queen Storytime, which is a childhood literacy program that combines drag with childhood literacy programs at public libraries. It just stopped the in-person protest against Drag Queen Storytime events because they were ramping up in 2018, 2019, and then stopped in 2020. But we've seen a resumption. And to your point, Alan, what we've seen now is a shift, particularly in the United States, and I'll get back to Australia and the UK in a minute. We've seen this shift now, whereas, the commentary in relation to Drag Queen Storytime pre-COVID was, the gays are okay. It's just don't dress up as women and trivialise, womanhood. Since then, we've had the gays against groomers rhetoric go ballistic in the United States. It's been used, that very benign Florida bill that was titled, I think, Rights and Education for Children, was then picked up by LGBTQ groups and said it was it was a bill against gays. And then the anti-LGBT groups have then said that it's an anti-grooming bill. So the gays are now back front and center in this whole debate and perceived as a harm to children again. That's being conflated as it is over time and through these sexual emergencies that Belant has talked about since the 90s. And then with TERFs, so the protest in Melbourne, the anti-trans protest in Melbourne, there were TERFs there. That is definitely a debate that's playing out on Twitter and social media, and people getting cancelled. It's highly vitriolic. It's highly, polarized. But that's definitely playing out here. And J.K. Rowling is probably the most visible person that's caught up in those debates in the UK.
Yeah, and I find her to be an interesting avatar in the United States when I try to talk to people to say, in no way excusing, I think, the stances she's taken, but to be like, they'll be confused. They're like, I didn't think that JK was, a right winger. I'm like, well, in the British context, it just doesn't read this way, right? It just doesn't. I mean, in the United States, we've polarized. The partisan polarization in the United States is such that it's become pretty clear at this point that if you're for trans rights, you read as a Democrat. And if you're not, you read as a Republican, and there's not really a lot of in between. And then you have some Republicans who, at this point, they're already the ones who are breaking with their party on other things, like Trump and stuff, who are sort of saying this is maybe we shouldn't be doing this in terms of the crackdown. But generally speaking, it reads pretty split in terms of the partisan issues. And I don't know if that valence is really the same in Australia, in terms of Labor's commitment to protecting these groups versus this is really going to confuse American listeners, the Australian Liberal Party, which is the center-right party position on them. Which I'm actually really curious about that. If it does it, I know in the UK it doesn't quite read as a neatly left-right thing. In Australia, does it?
So what I would like to do, because a lot of my background is in media studies and I worked in corporate communications for years. So one of the biggest problems we're facing, and you're definitely facing it in the States, we have less of an issue with it at the moment. We've got these polarities. Okay, mainstream media companies are still trying to get back the loss of advertising revenue. This is very, media structural, but you're woke or you're not woke. Right. Now, what does it actually mean? Not a lot. There's a spectrum of political perspective that has been lost because you're left or you're right, which is a construct, know. So what we've seen, okay, and what I can relay to you in Australia is, political parties aside, we had a massive growth of the crossbench. So independents. So that, I think it expanded by 10 parliamentarians. We went from 6 to 16 in the last federal election. We've had the worst turnout for, Do you want me to explain?
Lost to an independent as well, didn't she?
She didn't. She lost. No, she lost. Catherine Deves lost. Yeah, and she wasn't an incumbent anyway. But She lost to an independent. Right. And so we've seen this massive expansion and loss mainly to the Conservative Party. Big loss to the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's misnamed because it used to be liberal in the economic and moral sense, but it's lost its way with morality. With people like Catherine Deves. But my point is that we've also got preferential voting. So our voting system, and we have compulsory voting, so most people vote. It forces everyone into the middle. So that middle, though, is highly contested because we've got all these independents. Because people said to both major parties, no, you do not represent me. We've had this manufactured two-party political system that's worked relatively well up until, say, 2010. Not working so well now. You've had gridlock in the States for God, how many, in terms of Congress? Yeah, it's and the whole left right, it just doesn't work. And Australians are I think on the whole quite pragmatic and see through the bluster. And we've had a lot of nonsense here for a decade, a lot of political nonsense. So,
I think Americans would be fascinated by some of the inner workings of sort of Canberra parliamentary politics, especially all the backstabbing. So the other, I suppose, the flip side, we're talking a little bit about how some of this anti-trans stuff can travel internationally. So I'm really interested in your work. You use the term Digiqueer. And look at these online expressions and communities and pathways. So I'm really curious if you could unpack that a little for listeners and talk a little bit about. To me, it seems that this is, as always with these kinds of issues, when we're thinking about in the 21st century sort of globalized challenges in Western liberal democracies, there's bad stuff that gets globalized, and there's lots of good things that also get globalized and can travel. So I'm curious if you could first unpack the term a little bit for listeners, and then talk a little bit about some of the ways in which I think those pathways have been beneficial to those communities for finding connection in transnational contexts.
Yeah, definitely. So this term Digiqueer, so digital queer, it came out of research I was conducting on the relationship between bystander social media video of police excessive force and its relationship to trust and confidence in police in LGBTQ plus communities. And so since that research, the notion's broadened to convey the relationship between queer expression and the digital media technologies that might be used to both empower diversity of expression and to shut it down through vilification, through shadow banning, where you're blocked from a site that you don't know, and then through rabbit holes where people who are searching for unwanted same-sex attraction will be sent down a rabbit hole that will misinform them about the perils of same-sex attraction, if there are any, and then misinform them about conversion therapy. So big issues here. But that term I use as a frame to put technology at the forefront of how identities are being negotiated, because much of it is happening through technologies now. There's research, digital media technology. There's research on, for example, trans negotiation of identity before coming out, and these safe pockets online where you can do that. So, we know that digital media, digital platforms, they are incredible for self-expression if you're in a safe pocket. If you're not, or that safe pocket turns into something that you didn't expect, like hate raids on the streaming platform Twitch, that were actually, these hashtags and aspects of those of raids. Raids were a positive thing that the trans community asked for, because what it did was allowed you, once you'd finished streaming, to send your stream to like-minded people. But then that was basically taken over by bots and hackers. And then used to turn hate against trans communities, same-sex attracted people, and so on. So that's what the Digiqueer is trying to emphasize: the technological dimensions of expression, for better and for worse.
Right. One of the things I think that looking at that in your research makes me think about is how much, and this is also something, at Pulaski, we emphasize this idea of place-based approaches to problems, and really not just sort of saying, there are global problems and they happen locally, but like really in putting where a particular issue is playing out at the foreground. But place is so much circling around all these conversations, right? We're talking about the Digiqueer and the idea of finding places online where you can be yourself. And then also when we're talking earlier about policing drag shows or policing trans individuals, so much of the language that's now being used has to do with things like, when we mentioned TERFs, protecting women's spaces and places. When we talk in the United States about drag shows, something like, what kind of space is this? Is this a family? In other words, is the sort of argument that's happening is this notion that what's being done is not suitable to the place in which it's unfolding. And I find all of this very, very interesting, right? It's this idea of sort of, well, there are places for you, but they're just not here. And one of the things that this also makes me think of a lot, that we were talking about before I started recording, and I'm really interested in having you unpack for people now, is alongside that, I think that for at least a lot of Americans, and I think probably people when they think even in a global context to a degree, there's a sense that there are places where these people belong. And in the political contestations right now, that's not in libraries or not in children's spaces or not in women's spaces. But more geographically, I think a lot of people think, well, they belong in cosmopolitan centers as well, right? They don't belong, if you're concerned about, the laws we're going to write in Tennessee or Mississippi, well, really, the place for you is New York or San Francisco or Sydney or London, places that are sort of famous for uh, having pride parades and being multicultural and cosmopolitan. I mean, famous today, right? Because I think we could, even in those places, have conversations around the fact that historically it's really queer communities were often relegated to neighborhoods, right? This is your place. These blocks, that's your place, right? But all of that leaves out the idea that a lot of places, and we push back on this a lot with the idea of heartlands as not being a monolith, that a lot of these rural, or even not necessarily rural, but regional or provincial places away from those big giant centers are actually quite diverse, are quite vibrant, are full of, obviously not just full of people of varying ethnic backgrounds, but people of varying gender identity and sexual orientation, and are full of all of these communities. I've only been to one drag show, and I went while I was at a Christian affiliated college, and I went to one in Little Rock. So go, right there. And I went with a friend who was also at the time a student there. We're both graduated, so they can't do anything about it now. That all that to say, that's an example of something that totally doesn't align, I think, with people's sense of the boxes in which we'd like to place these things geographically, socially, in terms of various kinds of locations. So I'm interested in probing that sense of how often we try to compartmentalize queer groups into having the places that belong to them and then the places that don't belong to them, and how that butts up against these current conversations.
Yeah, I think that the current conversations are, okay, for the legislation in Tennessee, for example, that's banning drag performance taking place on any public property in the state, as well as any location where people under 18 could be present. Now, I think that, and then there's, again, we've got conflation on one level with gays against groomer rhetoric and the harm of children, and then we've got the conflation of adult entertainers, drag performers performing in front of children. Now, drag performers perform a spectrum of expression. They can equally reach children as perform a lewd show somewhere. So I think that, again, back to the binaries, that just doesn't help anybody. But if you want to make the show age appropriate, fine. And then from a geographic point of view, I can reference Newcastle as an example. There's a drag queen from Newcastle called Timberlina, who I caught up with in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and he's done tours of Western New South Wales, going to places like Broken Hill, Mudgee, these small towns. I grew up in a town called Orange, by the way, Alan, a town of maybe 35,000 people on a farm. So I get it in terms of the heartland. But he talks about doing these tours, the farmers coming up to him, loving it. And I guess my point here, to your point, is that these identities exist in most places. It's just that they're either not visible or it's unsafe to be visible and so on. And I think that COVID's also provided us with an opportunity where people moving out of the cities, people are moving to Tasmania, people in the States, I'm sure, are doing the same thing. So I'm thinking that we might see a, more visibility, because you're going to have more concentration of diverse people that feel safe enough to be able to express themselves. But the whole idea of the city, country, regional divide is, I think it's just an artifact of the fact that, it's just been framed in that way, and media frames it in that way. The rare, country gay, or the only trans person in a regional city, there's probably more. It's just that they're not visible, or they don't feel safe to be visible, is my sense.
And that, to me, that's always, the thing that's frustrating in these conversations, right? How often safety is foregrounded, but it's foregrounded oftentimes, right, in terms of restricting the rights of people who already don't feel very safe, right? And this gets at the politics of, right, people who are trans rights activists have mentioned, especially as you're going through a transition, just being out in public can be quite harrowing. And some of these laws, like the one in Tennessee, it's not entirely obvious if particularly a person who is trans who is early in their transition or might still be read to other people as someone who has, if they're a trans woman who reads to some people as as having masculine traits in a way that could somehow be tied up in this language of criminalizing essentially performing the other gender in public just by living.
Yes.
That's a very disturbing line of thought.
Yes, and I think too, Alan. To my mind, why does this conduct need to be legislated anyway as a starting point? I mean, even from a Republican, not US Republican Party, but republicanism, dominion, freedom from domination. Why do these things need to be legislated? It potentially, as you pointed out, criminalizes a whole range of conduct that is not currently criminalized. It's ambiguous. It will have a chilling effect on expression. We know that if people are not free to express themselves, that we saw it through COVID. A whole range of suffering happens as a consequence of having to subvert particular perspectives or what have you. So first of all, I would question why it's being legislated at all. And then what are the implications, the unintended consequences? I think they're potentially huge. So I find it troubling that this wave of the bills, and some of it's now law, like Tennessee, but
Right.
really, yeah, why do you need to legislate it?
I mean, I think that raises a crucial point that we're really concerned with at Pulaski, which is the slippage in the, especially the liberal part, obviously in democracy, but especially in the liberal part of liberal democracy, and not just in the clear-cut ways of laws being passed. Those are the big, five-alarm problems, but also in the broader public's commitment to these principles, right? In terms of how much they're willing to accept of limitations on other people's rights to just sort of stake a claim in society and in the communities that they reside in. And I think that's something I'm very interested in terms of in the United States. I think the problem is very clear. We have a big problem. I mean, there are states, and the federal nature of our system means that there's quite a lot of power handed to many of these governments. So we've got a very big problem because there are places where these laws are being passed. Restrictions on drag shows, restrictions on children who want to have gender affirming care. Ambiguous laws that may in fact impact adults who are already transitioning, etc. I'm curious if you are as worried in this sort of big picture sense in Australia, or if it's playing out in a more regionalized way in terms of that.
Well, I think, and the other example that I would use from a United States point of view is the pushback in Kansas on the attempt there to redefine the legality of abortion. And right. I think that the certain constituencies the world over will breathe a huge sigh of relief that had actually happened. But also, was also given my research, the resources that go into protecting basic rights like that are phenomenal. And good on Canvas for getting it together, but highly atomized. So I think we were talking earlier, in the US, you might have, given your complex structure, you might have county by county differences on particular forms of social regulation. In Australia, I think I'm not as alarmed as I would be if I was in the United States, given what's happening at a legislative level. We've got, I think, Victoria going the other way, is they're legislating against conversion therapy, for example. So I think back to Australia being a preferential voting system that literally pushes everybody into the middle. We have less religious affiliation, so there's less capacity to justify those arguments. The bedrock might be religious, but you can then amplify that to harm of children in other ways. So I'm not concerned immediately, but I'm watching with with concern that what happens in the United States, particularly from a media production point of view, can make its way here. We also see with Proud Boys neo-Nazi protests, that's happening here.
It's stunning to me that the Proud Boys would make it to, I mean, and so depressing as well, because it's such a ridiculous, I mean, obviously their beliefs are terrible, but they're also just sort of such a farcical kind of group.
Well, but I think, they're like see, this is with with Trump, clearly we saw, the last year, 2019 saw this massive surge of anti-LGBT hate groups. And then we saw off the back of the Capitol riot, we saw a massive increase in enrollment in Proud Boys membership in 2022. So I think really what we're also trying to do, and what I'm trying to do with my research, is we're trying to make sense of, say, the years 2015 to 2020, because clearly what was playing out across, computational politics with Brexit, with Russia and its malign influence, espionage has become the top problem for everybody. We're only really just beginning to get a handle on this, and social media channels have been running. Facebook was set up in 2004, YouTube in 2005, but it's getting worse in terms of them not addressing the hate because it's been amplified and what have you. So I'm still worried about that. I see the pressing issues are that online hate is still not addressed adequately. I think TikTok, from the report out of the EU in 2022, TikTok is the only digital platform that has improved their record on addressing online hate. So none of the American ones. And obviously Chinese owned ByteDance of TikTok. And that's one of the main issues. This intersection with far-right extremist groups, that's obviously troubling as well, and particularly when politicians are getting involved. But let's see where that goes. We've got this increase at the moment. Let's see how that plays out. I don't know where that's going to go.
To bring us just back a few moments when we were talking about some of the concerns you mentioned, like I mentioned, right? The fact that these kinds of identities don't just exist in the Sydneys and the San Franciscos of the world. You grew up in regional Australia. I'm obviously from Arkansas, which is a pretty flyover country, as many Americans would call it, right? So, and that's where I first encountered queer culture, not actually in New York, in Arkansas, and so some of your research has also looked at the relationship between queer communities and policing in Newcastle and the Hunter region, which, for people not as familiar with Australia, is a region north of Sydney, vibrant agricultural region. Newcastle is the main city that kind of anchors this, but there's a lot of agricultural production, a lot of very good wine country in the Hunter, and other agricultural production as well. But I think that's an interesting pathway into, right, a very specific place it is regional, right? Newcastle is large in the sense that it's the second biggest city in New South Wales, but much smaller than Sydney, right? And it is a regional area that probably gives some insight. And I'm curious about what some of that has maybe revealed to you about the nature of some of those relationships in these places that are more rural, more agricultural, away from the big cosmopolitan center.
Yeah, I think it's, and Newcastle's fascinating because it's as you rightly say, it's had an agricultural history, but it's also had a huge mining history, and those industries have often and increasingly are in conflict in terms of which one's going to be prioritized. But that's also meant that it was heavily regulated, I guess, socially through mining, like companies like BHP, but also through the Catholic and Anglican churches. So it's a fascinating study. And also its relationship with Sydney. So it's 2 hours north of Sydney, for listeners who may not know where it is. It's about a population of about 700,000 people on the coast, like most Australians live on the coast. And it's come into its second renaissance at the moment, with lots of wineries, good food, lots of apartments, like most lots of cities in Western liberal democracies. And so the policing relationship is interesting because we have a federation like the United States. And so Newcastle's in New South Wales. So there's kind of like this relationship, definitely with the judiciary and the police between Newcastle and Sydney. But obviously Newcastle has its own culture. If we then shift to the 90s, so conservative in the 50s, like most of Australia, and then you have the expansion of human rights in the late 60s and 70s. Then you have massive pushback in the 70s from the Newcastle community, particularly over a death of a gay worker at one of the local newspapers, and the invasive way that the police handled that. They interviewed a phenomenal amount of people. They were threatening to out people, and so on. So that was in what year was that? Was that 1977, I think? And then we've got the first Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras in 1978. So you can see locally what might have been happening in Newcastle. What was happening in Sydney was happening. Its own version was happening in Newcastle. But then by the 90s, you've got cases there about the need to recognise same-sex couples coming out of Newcastle. So Newcastle then became instrumental in shifting the political landscape on acceptance of same-sex marriage and same-sex relationships. If we speed dial then to the same-sex marriage postal survey in 2017, I think Newcastle recorded the highest yes vote outside of metropolitan areas. So yeah, it's a fascinating case study in the way that I think expression of diverse identities, sexual identity and gender expression has completely shifted. Tasmania would probably be the other one, because Tasmania, homosexuality wasn't decriminalised there till 1997. And now it's one of the, I think they tout themselves in some of the paraphernalia as a rainbow state. But but you can see how communities can be highly effective. Mm-hmm. And I think I think back to what's happening in the States. I'm sure that some community, well, no, I don't want to make an assumption, but the resources it takes, the time it takes to get organised, and you're up against it with networked anti-LGBTQ stuff in a way that we just aren't. So, but I also know that the LGBT communities are highly effective. It's just about, and I think too that with the media, like there's a lot of noise about what's going on, but back to the statistic on US people that support same-sex marriage, if you've got 71% of the population supporting same-sex marriage, then arguably, I mean, how many people are really supporting these, the sexual emergency over trans rights and drag queen story time? It's just, they're very loud, is my sense.
I think the downside in the United States is because of the first past the post system and the power that state governments have. And this, it's something that we're really preoccupied with as well, right? At Pulaski is there's just a strong incentive for people to leave. Whereas I've been saying, we've both been saying, right? It's a false story that queer people in these places only exist in Sydney and San Francisco and in New York. The downside is, the flip side, I suppose, is there are plenty of queer people in Arkansas who are looking around and saying, maybe it is time to pack up and go to Seattle. Because it's, I live in a state where, because it's become so partisan, right? And because the issue now reads in such a polarized partisan sense, and because the party that supports trans rights in the state can't really do better than about 35%. There are long-term, I don't blame people from mulling leaving. I think I'm also curious if you see that there's a shift, in Australia, if there's any kind of pull for people from regional communities to get out. I know that I know Australia's biggest cities are growing, and I know a lot of that's just economic opportunity and they're wonderful cities, but I'm curious how much cultural acceptance drives internal migration in Australia the way it absolutely does here in certain parts of the country.
Yes, I don't know if I've got a simple answer to that. What I know is that I've had friends of mine who stay in Victoria. They've left Sydney to go to regional Victoria to live on a farm, to rewild the farm, put in native species, this kind of stuff. I think I see, with having grown up in Orange, another regional town, and my nephews and niece, none of them live in Orange. They're not LGBTQ, but they've all left for economic purposes. One to go to university in Canberra, the other two, one's in Newcastle, one's in Sydney. And I think it'd be a mixed bag on that front, Alan. I'm sure there will be people that would be leaving because of their personal circumstances related to their sexual identity or gender identity. But then others, we saw this massive push to the regions, Newcastle and Orange in particular, during COVID. And I think we're yet to see what the benefits and detractions of that are. You might end up with, there's another couple that I know that moved to Tasmania. So I think, I don't know, to be honest. Maybe it's a research project.
No, it does sound like a really interesting question.
Yeah.
So we have now we've been talking about, I think, quite serious and heavy things. We've come to the part where I ask you a chatter question, which is, And I'm glad we got to, in the course of the conversation, introduce the hunter and Newcastle in terms of what they are. So I think most people, if they're coming to Australia, are going to, when I went as a kid, Sydney, Brisbane, all those places. But if they manage to make it to the hunter, to Newcastle, do you have anything that you would say? Anything, it could be a national park, it could be a museum, it could be a restaurant, it could be a particular kind of experience that you would be like, if you want to get that experience that isn't city, you're in the hunter, that is quintessentially this place, that they should do or try. What would you say?
I've got a couple of places. So one would definitely be Redhead Beach.
Okay.
Which is what is it? I mean, it's got a beautiful headland, and there's a great cafe there, and so you can go there on a Saturday morning. It's also next to a massive sand dune, so I think that the Hunter provides access to a hell of a lot of nature and water in a very short, very concentrated spaces. So I think that's definitely one. Redhead Beach. There's also a great restaurant downtown called Signal Box. It's the old railway signal box because yeah, it's really cool. But it's got great Australian seafood, great Australian wine, and I would go there, for dinner. Definitely those two things.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Justin Ellis, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Alan.
The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.